Welcome back, and welcome to tonight's class, the Great Shabbat. The Great Shabbat, or Shabbos, is the final Shabbos before the holiday of Pesach, the holiday of Passover. Why is this Shabbos called the Great Shabbat? What does that mean? What happened that made that Shabbos be so great? How does it relate to Passover? And how does it relate to us today? We'll also be talking at the end of today's class about some Passover reminders that is important for us to keep in mind. So bear with us. So the Great Shabbos is the Shabbos before Passover. It's this starting tomorrow night, this final Shabbos before Pesach, which begins on Wednesday evening. Why is it called the Great Shabbos? Is explained in Jewish tradition because of an incident that happened in Egypt right before the Exodus. So for that, we have to understand the timing. Timing and the calendar was exactly like this year. It's another interesting way in which this Passover, in addition to the stay-home rule, as we've been talking about, is actually very similar to the original Pesach, the original Passover in Egypt. So, and the setup of the calendar means that Passover was Wednesday night, and the Jews actually left Egypt the next day on Thursday. And the Shabbos before that was the 10th day of Nisan. Today is the 8th of Nisan, and the 10th day will be this Shabbos, 10th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. What happened on that 10th day that's so important? Well, before the Jews left Egypt, they had the mitzvah of the Passover offering, which was the lamb that they used as a Passover sacrifice, and they actually ate it that night for the Passover dinner. So the original Seder looked a little different than it does today. The matzah and the maror may have been the same, but there was a major component that we now do not have because there's no temple, and that was the roasted lamb. Some of us are missing that. Others are doing fine without it. Be that as it may, the process in that particular year, so the Passover offering is offered every year as long as the temple stood in Jerusalem. And we still commemorate that on the Seder plate with the zroh, with the neck bone that we roast for the Seder plate in order to remember that roasted lamb of the Passover offering. But in this first year, when the Jews were about to leave Egypt, there was a specific rule. And that rule was that they each brought the sheep home 4 days before. 4 days before Passover, they didn't just buy the sheep and select the sheep. They actually brought it home and had it ready. It required, as other sacrifices do, an inspection. But they actually had this process of bringing the sheep, the lamb for the offering, home 4 days before Passover on the 10th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, which would be this Shabbat. Well, that wasn't such a simple thing in Egypt. In Egypt, the deity, the pagan idol worship, there was more than one, as pagans tend to have. That included Pharaoh, who was considered a god, the Nile River, but sheep were a deity as well. We see this coming up multiple times in the biblical discussion of Egypt. Sheep were worshipped. And if sheep were worshipped, it was a bit risky for Jews to take sheep home and say, we're going to slaughter this sheep. This was the Egyptian version of the holy cow. Holy sheep you don't slaughter. Well, the Jews persevered, and following the mitzvah, they did actually take the sheep and prepare it for the Passover offering. And of course, the Egyptians saw what was going on, forcing the Jews to explain that yes, we will be having this offering, and that we will be having this for dinner on Wednesday evening at the Seder night, and then God is going to strike the firstborn, and we will leave Egypt. Well, this comes after 9 plagues. 9 times that Moses had warned Pharaoh that trouble would befall the Egyptians. 9 times that he didn't listen, and the devastating plagues came along. Well, by this time, even the skeptics understood that Moses' predictions of plague were meant to be taken seriously. And here, the firstborn sons had a problem. Pharaoh doesn't let the Jews go. We, the firstborns, pay the price. And they all went to lobby with Pharaoh to insist that he free the Jews before they die that night in the 10th and final plague. Pharaoh, of course, had a hard heart, and he refused to let the Jews go. And actually, this sparked a civil war. The unknown detail of just a few days before the Jews left Egypt is that the firstborns went to war with, Pharaoh's forces in order to try to impose freeing the Jews from Egypt before they would all die. Well, we don't have much details on that, but apparently Pharaoh got the upper hand because nothing ever came of that, and the Jews did stay until the night of Passover when the firstborns were killed, and then the Jews did leave Egypt. So this miracle, which was Egypt collapsing from within, is what's marked on the Great Shabbat, the day of the great miracle of that kind of incident in Egypt. Of course, that's a little bit strange. Why would we celebrate the civil war? Understandably, we do want Egypt to collapse if it's a tyrannical regime oppressing the Jewish people for 2 centuries. We want the Jews freed, but it's not the Jewish way to celebrate death and celebrate destruction. Why would we celebrate a war? Particularly that it didn't turn out to contribute at all to the liberation of the Jews from Egypt. What are we so excited about? We call this miracle the Great Miracle, the Great Shabbat, as if it's not just a miracle and not just something special and wonderful, but something tremendous, something great. Why would we celebrate and make such a big deal of what is essentially a sad story of war and conflict and death, although it's on the other side? We have to remember that even as the Jews crossed the sea, and God drowned the enemy, the pursuing Egyptians, in the sea. And then the Jews famously sang the song of the sea, praising God for the miracle. Well, as the Medrash teaches us, God wasn't only happy. I mean, it's important to praise and thank God for a miracle that he performs, but God says, my creations, human beings, are drowning in the sea and you're singing songs. Of course, those human beings didn't act very human, and they were the enemy, and they were deserving of destruction. But that is not something to celebrate. And God says, you're singing and celebrating when my creations are being lost at sea? You're celebrating death and downfall? So why is it that when it comes to the Great Shabbat and this miracle of the civil war in Egypt and the internal Egyptian collapse, why is it that we're celebrating that and making this the big and special and great miracle? What warrants and how is it even Jewish to celebrate such a phenomenon? But one important thing we want to remember is how Judaism really works, or shall we say, the true goal and the true perspective of the Torah and Jewish life and the performance of mitzvahs. In some religions and in some beliefs, the holier and greater, more sublime, more connected is the one who is less engaged in the physical and material world. Take the Buddhist monks, obviously the prime example of separation from anything that's material and rejection of physical and regular material life for a meditative existence. Even in other religions closer to this area, it would be the clergy would be celibate and separated from regular life. All of that doesn't exist in Judaism. In Judaism, we are meant to be a part of this real life physical and material world. We are meant to live the regular and civilized human life. But we are supposed to do that in a holier and greater way. God had enough angels before we came along. We didn't come to try to be the next batch of angels. We are here to live that human life, but to suffuse it with holiness, to bring a greater ideal, a greater commitment, a greater connection into the regular, we might call it conventional, mundane human life. ultimately the goal of Judaism, the end point we were all trying to get to, is when that change, that impact, that drawing the holiness and greatness and godliness in to the physical world transforms our physical world and transforms our reality to be a total godly place. And that's, of course, the time of the Mashiach, when we'll really experience a world of perfection, a world that's godly. But all through Jewish life and all through performance of the mitzvahs and all through study of Torah, all through prayer, our constant objective is really to bring this energy, to bring this spirituality, to bring this sense of connection into the regular life that we live, into the regular world that we inhabit, to share that, to spread that with what's mundane around us. It should no longer be mundane. Now that happens all across the board and on every level. When we perform a mitzvah, we use physical objects that are now transformed. The holiest artifact in Jewish life is a Torah scroll. Ultimately, a Torah scroll is parchment. So cow hides and ink and wooden poles, typically. These are the basic materials of the physical world that have now been elevated by transcribing the Torah on them, become holy and great and advanced, and are now a part of a godly reality, now an expression of something so godly to the point that we respect it with such reverence and we treat it as something so holy. That's a prime example of taking a neutral physical material object and making this holy. But that is a goal that's all across the board and happens, like I mentioned, on every level, to the point where the real points and the real extreme would be to achieve that even within the negative. We can take something negative, we can take something which is opposed, which seems to be a contradiction to what we stand for, which seems to be the opposite end of the spectrum. It's the enemy. We take the enemy, we take that other side, and we find a way to express within it the godly. We find a way to transform that, to turn that around, to turn that negative into positive. We have not only elevated that which is mundane and, shall we call it, neutral, not yet either positive or negative, just innocent physical matter like the hides used in the Torah scroll. But if we go all the way to the negative extreme and manage to transform that to the positive, we have taken the very lowest, the very most distant, the very most opposed, and we've totally drawn that to the holy and to the godly, which is, of course, a much greater impact. And this is what happened on that great Shabbos. On that great Shabbos in Egypt, the Egyptians began to change. Of course, it was ill-fated, but here's where you saw the seeds of change, the seeds of a new attitude, the seeds of a new behavior, the seeds of faith, of accepting what God says to free the Jewish people, the seeds of understanding that God's will be fulfilled, at the beginning of a better way to treat people and a better way to treat, of course, our people, the Jewish people. It's a transformation happening within Egypt. Now there is a whole movement, a movement of firstborns within Egypt that says, no, we're not going to put up with this. Let the Jewish people go. And that is a great miracle. A regular miracle would be God imposing his will. God splits the sea doesn't naturally split, but God decides that it should. A great miracle is when there's a partnership. And when the lower negative side, in this case the Egyptian tyrannical regime and nation, turns around and starts to become a part of what is true, what is good, and what is positive. That's the beginning that we see in that great Shabbat, with the great miracle, the time when the firstborn said, no, it's time to let the Jewish people go. And that continues throughout our history as we try to take every situation, even the most negative, and we try to take every opposition and turn it to positive, turn it to goodly, turn it to godly. There's a saying from the Baal Shem Tov that when there is suffering or pain or a predicament, tzara in Yiddish, or in Hebrew really, tzara, but you might be familiar with the way it's said in Yiddish as tsuris. When there's trouble, when there's a problem, we should make that into tzohar. So the letters for tzara, tzadik resh hey, spelling out the word tzara, spelling out the word of this misfortune or tragedy or problem, should now be transformed. Same letters, just reorganize them to tzohar, which means a light, the shining light. We should find within the negative, within that opposite side, the opportunity to turn that to positive, to turn that to godly. That's what happened in Egypt on that great Shabbos as a beginning process, the beginning of our history. And that's what we've been trying to do ever since. So really this kind of Shabbos should serve as a reminder for you and I and all of us that we all understand we find ourselves in a challenging situation. And humanity finds itself in a challenging situation, a very bitter and tragic situation with much loss and suffering. And hopefully it should come to its end very soon. But we need to take that opportunity to say, how are we going to turn this tzara into the tzohar? How will we make the negative into the positive? How will the Egyptian tyrants now become on our side? What will we do with the new realities that this puts before us? Will it drag us down, or will we turn them around to something positive? Will staying at home be a reason to turn to a couch potato, or will staying at home be an opportunity to connect with our families? Will less time at work make us lazy, or will that give us a chance for something that's more spiritual and that's more godly? So let's use this great Shabbos as a reminder of looking at a situation, at every situation, even the most tragic and bitter ones, and finding the way to draw the positive from it. Before we conclude, some reminders for Pesach, and this is because this will be our final class before the holiday. Next week, there will not be classes as we run up to Passover and during Passover itself. We will continue in the following week on Sunday, which would then be the April 12th. So, as a couple Passover reminders, Passover does begin on Wednesday night, and of course, it centers around the Seder on Wednesday evening, but we should remember that there's also a Seder Thursday evening. So Wednesday evening and Thursday evening, we should be conducting a Seder, and the Passover holiday continues all the way through the following Thursday, which, if I'm calculating right, would be the 16th. All the way through the following Thursday, it is Passover when bread is not eaten, and it is a special time of celebration. No chametz, yes matzah for all of that time. So this begins Wednesday evening. An important thing to remember about the Seder is that the actual Seder is conducted after dark, after nightfall. So you might be sitting down earlier, you might be celebrating from some earlier time with the family, it's beautiful, but the Seder itself is conducted after nightfall, and particularly the eating the matzah should be after dark, after nightfall. So it will become dark. Night will fall here in this area at 7:55 on Wednesday evening, and then very similar timing on Thursday evening. So matzah and really all of the important components of the Seder, such as the 4 questions, the story of the Haggadah, the 4 cups of wine, the Morah, should be done after that time, after 7:55, after dark, and especially, as I mentioned, the matzah. That matzah should be, as we've been discussing, handmade shmura matzah. If you don't have, it might be on its way to you from us. But if you'd like to make sure, please message me so that you get that matzah. And Pesach is preceded by the sale of the chametz, and I will post an easy and quick link for doing this online. The chametz should be sold before Passover, no later than Tuesday evening, and you can just do it right now by filling out that form. When Passover comes, your chametz will already have been sold and no longer actually in your possession, as the Torah mandates. So let's make this a happy, healthy, especially, and wonderful Passover. And let's remember that last year we called out at the end of the Seder, the Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Well, now it's time. Next year has come. Let's celebrate it this year in Jerusalem with the coming of Mashiach. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful, great Shabbos.